Hello guys, I went to school in 1991. And this may seem like an ordinary year for many of you, but this is a very extraordinary year in my part of the world. Because in 1991, the Soviet Union finally collapsed, and a lot of countries renewed their independence, including Ukraine. 1991 was a year of our joy, happiness, freedom, a year of our independence, and a year of problems, a year of poverty. Can you imagine how our teachers felt when meeting these new pupils? They had to change everything because for decades they introduced students to Lenin, Soviet Union, and now they were free to speak about Ukrainian national heroes. They were free to introduce us to Ukrainian national anthem. This was a year when we returned back our blue and yellow flag, when we started talking about a lot of important symbols of the Ukrainian country, Ukrainian nation. And it was pure inspiration. I remember myself reciting the first poem, and there were lots of us, small kids, and each had a letter, like a hat. And I had letter U, which stands for the first letter of Ukraina. And I had to recite a really small poem, but it was super emotional for my parents, not just because it was their favorite child reciting its first poem, but also because that was a poem about Ukraine in the independent Ukraine. I'm really happy that those videos where I speak about the collapse of the Soviet Union, the renewed independence of Ukraine from this personal perspective, from a perspective of a really small child, is of interest to you. And you share your thoughts, your memories in comments below, which I always read. And that is such a beautiful and meaningful dialogue that I've decided to continue. And you can let me know what areas of this life just before the collapse of the USSR or in the newly independent Ukraine in the early 90s is of interest to you. Because when I start thinking about such videos, I want to tell you a lot about, I don't know, school, about food, about clothes that we wore. So I will try to combine everything in this video, but I'm looking forward to your answers. And of course, subscribe, join the community of this very personal, very real channel. So I went to school in 1991. That is a very optimistic year when generations of Ukrainians who did not expect to experience free Ukraine received this gift. And I intentionally say received because what we are doing now in Ukraine, fighting against Russian aggression, fighting against Putin's desire to reconstruct the Soviet Union. By the way, he recently spoke about Soviet Union as an existing project, and I have a video reaction on that. But right now we are fighting for this independence because in 1991, in 1990, the monstrous Frankenstein of the Soviet Union simply collapsed, exhausted by very fake ideology, which actually none of its leaders followed, destroyed by war in Afghanistan, by insane economy, inflation, bankruptcy, and it all collapsed really quickly, freeing the nations. But the very process was pretty simple in comparison to what we experience right now. So many Ukrainians agree that in 1991 we received this independence and now we protect it, now we fight for it, and we know what we are fighting for. Another important thing that I want to attract your attention to, that in the 90s, 1990, in 1989, nobody believed, neither in Soviet Union nor outside Soviet Union, that it would collapse. And George Bush came to Kyiv to persuade Ukraine not to proclaim independence. That speech is known as Chicken Bush. Now we have Chicken Trump. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. And then we had Chicken Bush. And none of them managed to stop the need of the Ukrainian people for freedom. I think it's built in our DNA. That is something that we need just like air. So no matter what they say, no matter how they try to undermine our confidence, to shake our beliefs, they will fail. Because for centuries, Ukraine is fighting for that freedom next to a very toxic neighbor. What is also interesting, we all agree that in 1991 we renewed the independence because Ukraine is the country with thousands of years of history. And there was a period even in the 20th century, 1917, 1922, when Ukraine was independent. And the flag that we have now was the one that we had in early 20th century. And the same about anthem and many other symbols. So of course, Ukraine was not created by Lenin. Ukraine was not created by Peter the First. It is a country that way older than the classical Muscovy. And once again, if you look at our coins, if you look at our icons, if you look at the history books of your European countries, you will definitely find traces of Ukraine there. And I'm always happy when you tell me these connections that exist between our countries. For example, Ukraine and Norway, Ukraine and France. Anna of Kiev is, of course, one of my favorite characters of this medieval European history, and I'm sure you can guess why. So in 1991, we received that independence as a gift and as a result of numerous tragedies and miscalculations by the Kremlin, starting from, that Chornobyl disaster, which also undermined the authority of the Kremlin and many people who pretended to be politically neutral. That is what we observe right now in Russia. They keep saying oh, we are not about politics. This will not save you when Russia will destroy nuclear power plant because of its negligence, or when they will try to hide some very dangerous for human health or human survival things. And that is what perhaps made a lot of people around the USSR very angry. This poverty, absence of products on the shelves, super long queues, when we started, families started receiving cards to get something, that was just worse than perhaps after the Second World War. And always this fake image of the successful country. That is why, for those who were inside Ukraine, were inside Lithuania, it was no surprise that this monster must collapse. And the West kept repeating, no, it would be very dangerous, the nuclear war may come. You see, the Frankenstein collapsed and nothing happened. And we actually had 30 years during which we reshaped, strengthened our culture, our language, and now we are fighting this final war, I believe, in the result of which Russia will be defeated and Russian Federation will collapse, giving birth to new nations, just as it happened after the collapse of the USSR. So let's get back to my memories. In 1991, I went to school. So you can guess, I was not a pioneer. I was not that żółteniatko. That's the way they named smaller children. And it actually resembled Hitlerjugend a lot in Soviet Union, and people had to wear uniform. But actually, when I went to the first form, we had to wear uniform, and that uniform was just the same as my parents wore. So for girls, that was a blue, dark blue or brown dress with an apron, a black one for ordinary days and a white one for festive days. My mom saw that aprons for me, and they got that uniform, and that's the way I went for the first class, wearing white tights. And yes, I had bows, and I had very uncomfortable bag. They were typical classical bags, like every child had the same. And it was really difficult to get beautiful notebooks or pencil box. And I was addicted to stationery. I still am. And I remember one day my dad was saying how many pencils do you need? How many pens do you need? And I always had that sense of humor. I was really small and I've told him, you're lucky that I don't like jewelry that much. Enjoy that I like pencils and pens. And he started laughing, and I still like getting some beautiful pens or notebooks or something like that. So typically, all children had similar things. Classes were really big. For example, in my form, we had 38 children studying together. Only when in later classes we were introduced to English or some technical translation, we were separated into groups, but we studied together. And I remember later that my first teacher told my parents how excited they were to meet these new children, to meet children, this first class of the independent Ukraine. And once again, I'm very honored to be that first class. Oh, it sounds like double meaning, first class of the independent Ukraine. And at the same time, they did not have enough resources. They did not have enough time to prepare new books, new ABCs, and we had old ones with Lenin, with Stalin, and teachers would say us, skip page 9, avoid page 10. And at the same time, there were so many new traditions introduced to schools, and you could literally see teachers, parents, children very, very happy. And all the parties that we had, all the celebrations that we had were very traditional, very Ukrainian. People started buying their first vyshivankas. People wanted to celebrate Christmas. People wanted to celebrate Easter at school, not just at home, hiding, because Soviet Union is a very godless project. And I do remember that during that early 90s, we would always go to church with my parents for Easter. And in the Orthodox churches, you spend all night in prayers, and people walk around the church waiting for the resurrection of Christ. And there were tons of people around the churches. I have never seen anything like that. Well, later. It's not because we stopped practicing, but because there are a lot of churches built. In Ukraine, there are many churches. It's so stupid that Russian propaganda tries to distort the reality. Ukraine is one of the most religious countries in Europe, if not the most. And in my city alone, there are many dozens and dozens of churches, and literally every district, every block may have a small church, and people visit there. But in 1991, 1992, there were not many churches. Many of them previously were destroyed by the communists or were used as something different. For example, one in my city was used as the Museum of Atheism. Just imagine the level of this scene, the level of hypocrisy. So, and they were just transformed into gyms, into timber production facilities. But it may sound bad, but it actually saved these churches. So it was much better for it to be preserved even as a gym. And in the early 90s, they returned back to people, and that is why there were crowds. There were dozens of thousands of people were walking around the church, and I have this memory. It's very sacred. I also bless food before Easter now, but it's different, and not that many people, not all the night. And people were so happy that they were allowed to believe in their own freedom, in their own country, and in God. Please don't forget what the USSR brought to this world. A lot of tragedies, millions of tragedies, millions of personal and national tragedies. And please subscribe and share these videos if you share my opinion, because unfortunately still Russian discourses dominate, and that's very dangerous for the survival of the planet. And that was also a period when we first saw something different, when it was easier to travel, for example, to Poland and to bring a true income from that. And it was also a period of poverty because Ukraine still did not have its national currency, and because Soviet Union was a bankrupt, people lost a lot of money in the state institutions. They never returned. And that is another proof that the collapse of the Russian banking system is very real, and millions of Russians know they will lose their deposits. Like my family lost a lot after the collapse of the USSR. And for example, I remember that my cousin would come to my grandparents for summer vacations. That's very typical. He lives in Kyiv and he would come to Lutsk, which is a smaller city. His grandparents lived here. I lived close to grandparents, and he would spend his summer vacations here. And I do remember my parents always buying one ice cream for us, for two of us, one ice cream. Like this traditional, since Soviet times, one of typical ice creams in Ukraine is just like waffle glass and white ice cream, vanilla ice cream, or just, and they would cut it in half, it's easy, and give us two halves. And my parents always persuaded me back then that I eat half of an ice cream because they don't want me to catch a cold. They don't want me to have problems with throat, because when you eat cold, you can catch a cold. And I was convinced it's like that, even though these ice creams are not big. And later, when I grew up and we started talking about that and I shared these memories, my parents were laughing and they told me, we did not have enough money to buy two ice creams. We could not afford two ice creams, and we wanted you both to taste the ice cream, so we divided it into halves. So just imagine like this level of poverty. I'm not saying even about the clothes. By the way, if you want, I can film a separate video about clothes in that period in the Soviet Union, in my early school years, because most of these clothes were just like my mom's old sweaters, old blouses, and I was always so happy and so proud to be wearing them. And all these new costumes, they were improvised. An interesting fact, the most glamorous clothes were, of course, from China. So this connection between China and Russia, China and Soviet Union is very old, very long, very strong, and no Trump can break it. And it is one of the greatest political mistakes to believe that, I don't know, sacrificing Ukraine, they can break the link between China and Russia. No, it won't happen, because the center of their ideology is not just communism, authoritarianism, but hate towards the West. That's what unites China and Russia the best. So at the same time, I remember a lot of very happy people in my family, at school, on the streets, and all these happy people did not believe what is happening to them. They felt they live in the history book. They felt that their greatest dream came true, because, you know, we all have personal dreams and they can be very different. By the way, if you feel like saying that, let me know in the comments below what was the greatest like national, I don't mean very personal, but just like global social dream of your life that came true. For millions of Ukrainians, for generations of Ukrainians in 1991, that was their renewed independence. And they thought it is the beginning of very safe, very happy time. And indeed, it is much better to live in Ukraine than Russia, with all that misery, suppression, disrespect they experience on a daily basis. But it's very dangerous, because this monstrous imperial Frankenstein is agonizing, and you know, in that agony drops a lot of bombs and other evil. But we will survive, because the truth is on our side. And you know, when I think about my generation, I think I represent a very unique generation. And I don't want to be arrogant, but I have experienced so much that it is worth a lot of books. Actually, I have one more planned, but I'll share it later. Just have a look. I was born, and then Chernobyl disaster, which itself is enough for a lifetime of a person. Then finally the collapse of the USSR and this very first years of the independence. Then Russia tried to capture Ukraine again, Orange Revolution, and we started building our normal European future. Then Russia wants to hijack Ukraine in a silent way, as they did with Belarus, and implants Yanukovych pro-Russian figure. Then revolution of dignity, the annexation of Crimea, the start of the Russian invasion, now the COVID pandemics, now the full-scale war. But I do have a feeling that we will also live through time when Ukraine is victorious, when Ukraine is strong, and when Ukraine shares its bravery and its skills with its allies. And we are fighting for that. So please, in the comments below, let me know what are the other topics you would like me to speak about. And I feel very grateful and blessed that I can share these memories. Trust me, it is an extremely interesting process for me personally too. And remember to subscribe if you're new. Please like the video. This helps to show this ordinary Ukrainian experience and memories to more people on YouTube, and that is very important. Also subscribe to my social media, all the links in the description of this video, same as a link to our merch shop with lots of good items that work well as reminders and conversation starters about Ukraine. Thank you for buying me coffees, becoming sponsors and patrons of this channel, and helping me film and talk to you more. I'm very grateful to have such a community. Slava Ukraini!